Welcome everybody today here at the Mira Forum Photography Gallery in Porto, Portugal. My name is Henrik Brahe from Denmark. I'm a professional photographer and Near Eastern archaeologist, where my specialty is in the Middle East and North Africa. Today, here the topic is travel. A time travel back into ancient history and the making of this exhibition with the title Archives. I had my first photographic solo exhibition in 1983 in Odense in Denmark, the city where I was born. Since then, I have participated in more than 100 exhibitions, film and video festivals all over the world the past 4 years. My artistic inspiration as a photographer started in the beginning of the 80s with a trend called stage photography, which originated from the USA. Photographers such as Cindy Sherman, Joel Peter Witkin, Peter Beard and Dwayne Michaels were all pioneers in this trend. We were only a few of photographers in Denmark who practiced this new trend from the USA, moving away from the more classical approach into photography such as documentary, press, commercial and reportage. Already early in my career I was inspired by the classical journey. A lot of artists, painters and sculptors made a classical journey into Italy, Greece, Egypt, just to name a few countries. I have always had a keen interest in history. I've read many books since my childhood and thereby came to know the Romans, the Etruscans, the Spartans, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians and the Assyrians. They all left a monumental legacy such as Pantheon, Acropolis, the pyramids, Alhambra, Babylon and Palmyra, again just to name a few interesting places. I have myself traveled to a lot of these places and got inspired both artistically and visually in my work as a photographer and an artist. I got several travel grants from the National Art Foundation in Denmark and Accademia di Danimarca in Rome and lived for a shorter and longer period in Damascus in Syria and Beirut in Lebanon. It was during my first stay in Damascus in Syria at the Danish Cultural Institute, Beit al-Akkad, in 2001 that I really got introduced to the Middle East, the cradle of civilization, also known as Mesopotamia. Names such as Hammurabi, Sargon of Akkad, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, Petra, the capital of Nabateans, the Roman temple of Baalbek in Lebanon were among the names and places I traveled to, following in the famous footsteps of Marco Polo and the Greek philosopher Herodotus. I traveled extensively in the Middle East with my camera the coming years, visited the famous Crusader castles, rumbled around in the caves and graves in Petra with the local Bedouins, traveled in Syria and desert with camel, enjoying the Milky Way and shooting stars in the pitch black dark night. Visited later on the Roman town of Raqqa, which later became the capital of the infamous ISIS and their new caliphate. Went to the Friday prayer mosque in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus and had tea with the local carpet dealers in the souk. A year later, in 2002, I had my first solo exhibition in Damascus at the Danish Cultural Institute. The title was Architecture in Progress. The inspiration was the ancient history, architecture, and the classical cultic places all over the Middle East. At that time, I was considering to study art history at the University of Copenhagen, but I got very much inspired by the ancient history and decided therefore to study archaeology instead. Already 1 year later, I was back in Syria where I participated in my first professional archaeological excavation, working for the Danish professor and archaeologist Jesper Eidem at a Bronze Age site with the name of Usheria in the northern part of Syria. I've been excavating Neo-Assyrian palaces in northern Syria, Islamic castles in Aqaba in Jordan, Uruk temples in Iraq, Mesopotamia, Egyptian temples together with Marcus in north and south, conducted surveys in the desert Wadi Rum in Jordan, close to the border of Saudi Arabia, spending week after week in the desert, finding human settlements and ancient stone hand axes more than 25,000 years old. Often during the different excavations and expeditions, you are very long way from home. It requires often big logistics challenges and human sacrifices,
sometimes due to the weather. In the beginning of March in northern Syria, rains and big thunderstorms comes down from the Taurus mountains. Or August in Jairus, Jordan, the Roman capital, where the temperature can reach over 50 degrees Celsius in the sun, and you can fry your morning egg on the motorhood of your car at 9 o'clock in the morning. The same food every day for months and months, overboiled pasta and tomato sauce, while you just dream of a steak and a cold beer. You don't participate in excavation for the culinary pleasure, but to achieve academic and science results which can be studied now or later in the future. But at the same time, it is a big pleasure to be a part and member of a professional team where you all have a common goal, to uncover the interesting past. How was the emergence of urbanization, domestication of the animals, development of the flint tooth, continuing to the Bronze and later Iron Age? Putting all the small pieces together and thereby have a more profound overall cosmic picture. The excavation itself is often a variety of different nationalities from various countries. It requires that you are working together on a professional level, respect for every human, every gender, every religion, despite the cultural differences. During all my travels for many years, I've experienced a very warm welcome and curiosity from many different people in many different countries. Basic, we are the same, humans. We all have the same dreams and goals, despite we are born different places and come from different cultures. We are all equal. Often I've been asked, how you conduct an excavation physically? Are you using a bulldozer or what? No, we don't. We're using a wheelbarrow, a shovel and a trowel. These are the most important tools we use in our daily work. First, you lay out a trench using a theodolite. It can be 10 by 10 meter or smaller, even 5 by 5, depending on the circumstances and the locality. Then you very, very slowly move down centimeter by centimeter, layer by layer, strata by strata, until you find a cultural deposit. That can be a building, a grave, or floor. During excavation, you can reach several meters down or only centimeters, again depending on the difficulty and the circumstances. Here we come to the human hand. Since we can't use a bulldozer, we are totally dependent of the local workforce. Normally, it will be some of the local peasants from the local village we are hiring for the job. They are conducting and performing the hard, demanding physical work during the excavation, sometimes only using their hands for the task. No hands, no work. It is a combination of tools and the human hand together. I got inspired by the workers and the way they could perform with their hands, how delicate they could be, and at the same time move tons of soil during a whole campaign. Also, when you do the final archaeological publications, you will only see the gold, the palaces, the beautiful pottery, etc. You will never see the local worker portrait, and certainly not their dirty hands. I see the human hand as a portrait. Every hand is different, like a normal portrait. Every hand is distinct and natural wonder. So it was a tribute to all my workers. I wanted to visualize them and their important work. The main idea was to do an exhibition and later a book with the title Arch Hands, which means archaeological hands. All the photos here are at this exhibition are from different excavations in the Middle East, North Africa and Egypt. But I have to admit, it was difficult in the beginning of the project. I don't speak that much Arabic, but I tried to explain the best way I could do that it was a project for them in order to make awareness of their important work also as a person. We succeeded together, and that's why we're all here together today to watch the exhibition here at Neoform Gallery. It has been a privilege to work together with so many interesting persons and personalities the last many years. True professionals dedicated in every task in their line of work. Hereby I would like to introduce Dr. Marcus Müller from Germany at the University of Tübingen. He is a good friend and colleague, and we have been working together for many years in Egypt, where he's leading a very big excavation of the ancient temple in Athribis in Middle Egypt, with the name, the Temple of Redi, I think is the right pronunciation, yeah. He's a skilled photographer himself, and we are closely working together on the visual representation of the excavation every single day. Marcus, I hope you will say a few words about your background and the work, very interesting work at Athribis. And after that, you're very much welcome to ask any questions, and Marcus and I will try to answer them.
As Henrik already said, we've been knowing each other since almost 10 years or something.
Almost 10 years, yes.
Yes, we met at an excavation in the Delta, in the western Delta near Alexandria, where we excavated together also a temple, but the temple we excavated there is totally different to what we have in Athribis. He already mentioned Athribis, which is a site in Middle Egypt. So that's about 400 kilometers south of Cairo, as the crow flies, about 200 kilometers north of Luxor, also as the crow flies. And our temple in Athribis is a stone temple, whereas the temple we excavated together in the Delta was a mud brick temple. So that's a completely different story in terms of excavation. And when we started in the Delta, you can imagine this as a place of a field, green, and in the middle of these green fields there is a tell, which is a little mound, which used to be a settlement. And this is a brown hill. To be seen is nothing. And then you just start to scratch with your trowel and you find something. But what do you find there is, it's mud brick, actually. So if you're lucky, you find these mud bricks immediately after the surface. Henrik was brave enough to do that immediately, and he discovered actually the beginning of that temple. And then we were lucky enough to excavate at the same site, actually at the same spot, and we started to excavate this big mud brick wall, which used to be an enclosure of a temple. Actually, that's how we know each other, and when I saw him excavating, also with his experience and with his knowledge about photography, of course I realized that this could be the man for Athribis as well.
Thank you.
Because it was only a few years earlier that I started the project in Athribis, which was in January 2012. And from then onwards we had seasons of 4 to 5 months per winter to excavate a temple. That was known before, so that's a completely different story than the one we had in Conversa, where we started from scratch, not knowing what we were about to find. In Athribis it's different, because a famous Egyptologist, Flinders Petrie, was excavating there in the winter of 1907 and 8. But only for 7 weeks. His team was there for 10 weeks, he was there for 7 weeks, and he exposed the beginning, or actually a part, 1/3 of a temple, a stone temple, of the size of 75 by 45 meters. I think these people can enter if they want to.
Sure, yeah, no problem.
The door is open. I think they don't dare. There were already other people just passing by, and I think they don't dare to come in, but they can do.
They can do, they're welcome.
Yes. Anyway, I was referring to the temple of Athribis. Flinders Petrie was excavating there, and not only in the temple, but also in the whole site. He did a survey, and since then the site is better known. So it's a settlement, probably founded in the Egyptian late period, maybe the 30th dynasty, and we're talking about of the 4th century BC, roughly. But so far we don't know when the settlement was founded, because no excavation has been done over there. So in the settlement, in the temple, yes, since Flinders Petrie. There are also tombs. Flinders Petrie also excavated 2 tombs of the Greco-Roman period. And there is also a quarry in the area. So this is the whole environment that I'm talking about. And the temple itself is founded by a king of Egypt named Ptolemaios XII. So it's a Greek name because the king was of a Greek family actually. He was a general of Alexander the Great. And when Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BC, Ptolemaios was with him. Unfortunately, Alexander died 9 years later, and Ptolemaios was the one of his generals who claimed Egypt for himself. That's how this dynasty became kings of Egypt. And one of his descendants, Ptolemaios XII, ascended the throne in 80 BC, and he's actually the father of the famous Cleopatra. So he's the one who founded this temple, and as we now know from our excavations and from the study of the texts, this temple must have been built in the very beginning of his reign, because in our temple there is a relief which depicts his wife, Cleopatra VI, who's actually not the seventh, the famous daughter one. But since we exposed reliefs of Cleopatra VI, who disappeared in the winter or in the year 69-68 BC, we know that this temple must have been built before, of course, because she disappeared and the king would not have made a relief showing Cleopatra VI after she disappeared. We don't know why she disappeared. So the temple must have been standing before the relief was made. But since the temple is a very big one, 75 by 74 meters, up to a height of 15 meters, full of reliefs, this is an awful lot of work, of course. And so it's clear that this temple must have been built in the first decade of his reign, and including the production of reliefs, of course. So this is the chronological framework of this, actually, of this temple when it was founded. And we've been lucky enough to excavate the remainder. Petrie excavated 1/3. The Egyptian Antiquities Organization exposed another third of the temple. So there was 1/3 left for us. And the unique possibility and the unique quality of this temple was, for us, for the archaeological work, was that 1/3 of this big temple was still covered not only with sand, but with major archaeological layers, because it was normal for Egyptian temples that they were reused in later times. As you know, Christianity took over in the whole Roman Empire after Constantine the Great in the 4th century AD, and that means the pagan cults were step by step forbidden within a century, of course, until the end of the 4th century. And then these ancient temples were reused, and that happened to our temple as well. It was reused first in the late antique period, 4th century, 5th century, 6th century AD, as a Coptic monastery. So the Copts built a monastery around the temple, and they reused the temple itself for their own work. So they built workshops in it. As we know from finds and from Flinders Petrie's excavation, these vats, dyeing vats and basins that they were built inside the temple were used to dye cloth, most likely for red and black textiles. And this actually lasted for about 2-3 centuries. They were also using some other rooms for storage, but also for keeping probably things to eat, nourishments and everything. They had big pots up to 1.50 meters high in one room of the temple, and they were keeping probably grain or other types of food, maybe even olives or something. We don't know yet, because we didn't find any proper remains in them. And that lasted for a few centuries until the Arab invasion came in 642 AD. And then, step by step, it took about 100 years until the Arabs conquered the south of Egypt as well. And that meant that the monastery that took over our temple was closed, and then the Islamic faith took over within a few centuries. And the Coptic faith was a bit put aside, and the Coptic monastery had to be given up in the 9th century. And this meant that in our temple there was a completely reuse phase in the whole area. So until that phase, when the temple was part of the Coptic monastery, it was architecturally fully preserved. Then, in the 9th century, maybe 8th century already, the first destructions happened. So they destroyed the temple in one part, destroyed the front part, the front columns, and the roofs, tore down the stones, also from the walls, and smashed the stones out. Removed all the columns, all the big ceiling blocks except for one, and then they reused the first part of the temple as workshops and kitchens and storage areas. And how do we know that? Because of the excavations that we were doing. Because, as I said, the unique chance in this temple was to excavate all these layers that came in step by step. Because when the people were working in that area, they also had a lot of rubbish, and they had animals. So some rooms of these temples were used for storage areas, for disposing of rubbish, and for keeping animals. And if you keep animals, and if you throw in your rubbish in certain rooms, that means after a certain period of time, and we're talking of about 200-300 years, of course this adds up. And the rooms were slowly filled up. And this was our big chance, because this also means if you fill up rooms of a temple, of any building, with rubbish and other areas, this preserves everything that is underneath. So we had about 2-3 meters of archaeological layers that we could excavate since 2012, and you find a lot of objects of daily use that people lose or throw away because they are not fully intact anymore. And if you excavate these layers step by step, not only do you find what these people left or lost, but you also find what remains of the temple itself. And this is the building. So the building is preserved up to a height of 5 meters and 20 at one area, and in the areas that we were excavating about 3 meters high. So the unique chance was to excavate all this step by step, get all these layers from the topmost layers from an area where the temple was destroyed, finally, after that reuse. And we know that because in these archaeological layers, the finds tell us from which time they are. If, for example, this room would be filled up with the rubbish of today, and people would throw away clothes of our time, then nobody else would touch this room anymore. It would be filled with whatever, and all our clothes and shoes and
objects,
the watch,
yeah,
and
glasses,
the rings that you keep on your arms, that will be found by archaeologists in 1,000 years. And they are experts with all these things, experts of textiles, experts of technical issues, items. Then they would be able to tell, these objects must have been in use maybe around 2000 AD. And we do the same. So we have experts for textiles, for jewelry, as Patricia, for example, is working on our jewelry in Athribis. Then we can actually date these layers that we've been excavating. So we know that the final destruction of our temple was happening from the mid-10th century to the mid-11th century, roughly. And now, due to numismaticists, we know that the latest inhabitants, or not, maybe not even inhabitants, maybe visitors or something, were in our temple in the early 13th century, because a coin, the latest coin that we have, dates to the years 1228 to 1234. So this coin is excellently datable, so this time or slightly later, somebody must have lost this coin in our temple. Whatever he did there, we don't know, because that was a destruction phase. And in this destruction phase, people were smashing the temple to pieces. Actually, everything that was standing above the layers that we were able to excavate, because they were not digging down to get the stones. There were many, many stones above that, and they were smashing these stones to pieces in order to put the limestone into lime kilns to produce lime for further walls that he wanted to build, because you need lime for mortar and plaster, of course. So this is the reason why most of the stone temples got destroyed in Egypt, because over a period of 1,000 years, starting from the late antique times or even later in early medieval times, for centuries after centuries they were stealing stones from the temple, smashing them to pieces, putting them into lime kilns in order to produce material for their own. So this is actually the archaeological background of our work. And so Athribis had the unique chance to excavate all these layers. So only by these layers are we now able to tell the history of this temple from the foundation of Ptolemaios XII in the 1st century BC, over the reuse in Coptic times as a part of a monastery, and then in early medieval times when it was used as a kitchen, storage area, animal barn, or rubbish area until the destruction layer. Because all these layers tell us now the story of this temple of Athribis. And therefore we were really lucky to excavate this together since 2012 until the end in 2019 when this project was finished, and the temple is now open to visitors since 2020, and now we were heading on to another temple which is next to the temple where some of these photos actually were made. So the next 10 years will be full of another temple that is next to it, and next season, next winter, we will hopefully work together and start the next project. So that's actually the background, and this is what can be seen in some of the photos.
I think you should mention also, Marcus, that actually it was a unique possibility to excavate the temple from the Islamic period, because a lot of the other stone temples in Egypt was completely wiped out, and they were just digging down, just clearing out all the Islamic layers. So this is one of the few examples in Egypt where we have the chronology from the Islamic period down to the foundation.
Yeah, that's indeed right. That's why I said it was the unique chance to excavate this temple with all these archaeological layers, because the other big stone temples in Egypt were excavated in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And at that time, people were not interested in this history after the use of after the primary use of these pharaonic temples. So what they did was they were clearing these late layers, and they didn't pay attention to what was inside, and therefore the whole history of these temples after the use as a pharaonic temple is completely lost in nearly all Egyptian temples, actually in all big stone temples. So that was That's the reason why Athribis has now a really important point in
Yeah, you have a super
Egyptian
chronology
history.
in Athribis now.
Yeah, we have a full chronology from the 1st century BC to its destruction in the mid-10th to mid-11th centuries. Yeah. So we can tell a history of 1,000 years now, what happened in this temple, which is really amazing.
Maybe we should talk a little bit about the documentation also, as you mentioned various specialists also earlier, Marcus, and part of there also my job is to document the whole process, of course, of the excavation. As Marcus is mentioning, we're documenting layer by layer in order to, how do you call that, scientifically document how the excavation is going on. That's part of my job as an archaeologist, well, to do this documentation together in close collaboration with Marcus when we work together at the Athribis temple. And I was so fortunate also lucky to make, let's say, the sidekick with the Arc Hands project also. And luckily I was really lucky that the local work was also would like to contribute to this project as well. Despite there was a bit reluctant in the beginning because I only want to take photos of the dirty hands. And everybody said, no, it's really bad. We need to show the clean hands, so to speak, But eventually they grasped the concept of the project, so to speak.
That's true. Yes, our hands are usually relatively clean because he mentioned the documentation process, which is first identifying a new layer if you're excavating. And because you want to distinguish layer by layer, because each layer tells you a certain story. Some layers are rubbish layers, so people threw away their pottery mainly, or bones from eating, or destroyed objects of daily use, wooden objects, textiles, some of them loose coins or something, so that helps. Other layers are used for animals, for example, or for simply walking on it. So they are just mud layers.
A frosty surface.
Hard surface or something where people were walking all the times. Or you find surfaces where they were keeping animals, and then you find animal shit, which is mentioned, seen on this photo over there. This is sheep and goat shit. That we find lots all the time. Thousands, yes, indeed. So,
I think also, Marcus, you mentioned the very famous English archaeologist Henrik Brahe a while ago. Could you tell the background with the Kuftis or some of the workers, which is very important?
Yes. That's indeed important, yes. Because Flinders Petrie was a pioneer in archaeology in Egypt. An excellent archaeologist. He came to Egypt in the 1870s as a young boy, already actually in collaboration with Howard Carter because he was taught by Howard Carter how to document by archaeological finds or features by drawing them. Howard Carter was excellent, an excellent painter and drawer, actually.
Howard Carter is the very famous English archaeologist who found Tutankhamun's graves in the Valley of the Kings.
Yes, later, in 1922.
Exactly.
And Petrie was actually taught by him. And then he started his own career in the 1880s and excavated many sites. And since he excavated many sites all over the country, he needed skilled workers, and he was actually pissed off by the local workers that he all the time had to teach them again from the start what to do and how to do the excavation, because it's not just hacking down. You need to be careful when you do an excavation. That's why we usually work with trowels and be very, very careful and go centimeter by centimeter, actually. That's usually how you do it. And so he didn't want to teach each local community again and again how to excavate. So he said, I rather take people from an area where I am excavating now. That's what he said. And he was excavating in a place called Nakada and a neighboring place called Pelas. And Nakada and Pelas became famous because the next city to these two villages is Kuft. An ancient city also where there was an ancient temple already from the first and second dynasties, so 2900 BC. And when Petrie was excavating in Nakada and Pelas, he hired people from the city of Kuft and the villages around. And he taught them how to excavate, and then he decided to take these people from Kuft, the Kuftis, to all his other missions in the next 60 years he was excavating in Egypt. And this went from generation to generation on. So he taught the people in the 1880s, and these people themselves taught their next generations on and on and on throughout the lifetime of Flinders Petrie, who died, I think, in 1941 or something. And this tradition was ongoing, actually. Other archaeologists did the same by hiring the Kuftis from Petrie, because they were becoming more and more numerous, and then that tradition went on until nowadays. So I'm also hiring Kuftis as foremen in the excavation. And we did that in the Delta excavation and all over the place. So all over Egypt, if you go to an excavation, the foremen are usually either Kuftis or Gunawis, because people who work in Luxor, they hire people from a village called Kurma, which is on the western side, on the western shore of the Nile in Luxor. So Kuftis and Gunawis are now making our lives easier, because they know a lot of archaeological work, and they can actually teach the locals and show them how to work. But the Kuftis are usually the ones who expose the archaeological layers centimeter by centimeter, and they also, due to their experience, know where new layers start and where the current layer ends.
I think we have to mention one last thing with Flinders Petrie also, Marcus, that he was actually one of the first professional archaeologists which actually established an initiative using photography as a documentation, despite the drawing as well. There's some video, old nice photos where he's using the old big wooden camera as well in order to document the excavation itself. So we are actually working today, you and I, also in the legacy of Flinders Petrie, which I think is actually quite nice.
It's very nice. It's really an honor to work at the same site where Flinders Petrie was working. And now the second project is also a legacy of Petrie, because he excavated part of a pylon, which is an ancient Egyptian temple gate, the entrance to a temple, and he exposed one part of a pylon, of a large pylon, and we are now starting a second project to expose more of this pylon, and now it's much more visible. And when we actually were talking about our excavation, I mentioned at the beginning that the first thing to excavate, to start a new layer is to identify it. This is with the help of the Kuftis, and then we clean that new layer, and then we take the photos, usually with a high ladder, to take a photo of the whole layer from top and from different sides, if possible. And the next thing we do after the photography is then we measure the layer, length and width, of course, and then the height level, we do that measurement with a technical equipment, a total station, that gives us the coordinates of several points of that layer. So we go with a reflector around that layer, and then the total station gives us the coordinates of these edges of these archaeological layers, and also the level. And only then, when all this is done, then it is possible to excavate this layer.
Physically.
Yes, and each layer gets a number, And Henrik as an excavator, or we as excavators, then start to document this on a piece of paper. We make a sketch, and then we take the levels that we get from the total station on this piece of paper, so that we always know on which level of which niveau above sea level we are excavating.
And also it's important, as Marcus was saying, that we document each layer very thoroughly, because when we excavate, it's gone forever. So it's important it's proper documented, because in earlier times there have been very bad recording, I would say, and then it's super difficult to establish the whole chronology again. Yeah. So it's quite important that you document thoroughly all the way down when you excavate, because when you remove it, it's gone forever.
Yes. Yeah. That's it.
Super. You have more to add there, Marcus? Or okay. No. Thank you very much, Marcus. It was a pleasure. Thank you for coming. Athribis, and now we are open for business. If you have any questions, you are more than welcome. And Marcus and I will try our best to answer. Yeah.
I'll have a lot of questions.
Okay.
I'll start with two. One is, it's not a romantic activity. It's a very organized activity. It requires a lot of paperwork, because it's money has to come from some places. You have to give results to other people. So I would like to know a little more about that, because as you speak as individuals, but really this is a complex machine, a human machine.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. The other question now is, where are emotions on this? Mm-hmm. Because should be a lot of emotions going on, despair, happiness, joy, all kinds of things. That's real motivation for when you are on site. It's the joy, the pleasure, the fun, the discovery, the downs, everything. So these are two different points, but I have more later.
You should explain so you're the field director, Marcus, so you maybe explain the more technical part, and part of the work. It's a big logistic machine and it requires a lot of people working together. Marcus just told me yesterday that this season he is hiring 90 workers, and just to keep track of 90 workers, it's like a huge effort every day. So maybe you should explain a bit more about the technicality, logistics for the excavation, Marcus.
We live in a house that we are hiring from the Egyptian Antiquities organization. We are very fortunate because this is 5 minutes to walk to the temple. It's at the edge of the archaeological site. So we start in the morning at 7 o'clock, field work, so we leave our house at 5 to 7. The workers are already there. I register all the workers, and then they get their equipment, and we go to the temple and start working. So usually each excavator has its own place within on the site, and usually he has a certain team around him.
You will have 5, 6, 7, 8 guys maybe working for you, something like that.
Yes, now it's more.
It's more,
In the new project is more now. In the old project, in the Lepid temple where we worked together, we had about 30 workers. Now we have 3 times more in the bigger project, in the bigger temple.
So bigger teams now, Marcus? Or what, like
bigger teams now, yes. We have up to 39 wheelbarrows working and removing all the rubble and the sand and everything aside. So we have, as we said, we have these kuftis who are doing the precise work with the layers. And then we have a group of unskilled workers from the village, and they do the work with the wheelbarrows, with the shovel, with the axe, and all this sort of thing. They do the sieving, because if we remove a layer, we also want to find the tiny objects, for example, beads for precious jewelry research. And therefore, we put the stuff that we remove from the layers into the wheelbarrows, and from the wheelbarrows into a sieve. So I need some people who are only sieving the whole day. And they find, of course, all the small pieces that are necessary. Then we need, apart from the main excavator, such as Henrik, we need helping hands, such as students who do the registration of the finds, because he finds pottery, animal bones, he finds glass, textiles, ropes, wooden objects, jewelry, tools, stone tools, everything. Whenever we find an object, so he needs a tag for the object. This must be printed in advance.
I will take a photo of the object if it's in situ, for instance. You know, you need to measure it in, as Marcus mentioned before, with the total station. You know, yes, with the scale on, etc. Yeah.
Everything, all this must be prepared. So when he goes on site, he has a bag with him with all the forms, with a sheet where he records everything he thinks he needs to be memorized about this layer. What does it contain? The finds, the levels, the length, width, height, the mud bricks that are inside.
Also, they need to be measured, take a photo, etc.
Because mud brick sizes are different in each, not in each dynasty, but in each era. So pharaonic mud bricks are bigger than late period, late Roman mud bricks, for example, all these sort of things. Then we find walls, of course, we find installations, we find places where people were heating up their stuff to eat. We find canals, everything you can imagine. And all this needs to be a proper documentation. And then we need a guy in our working force who prepares the tea, for example.
The tea guy.
Photographed that as well. The tea guy. Yes, and now we have more of them actually.
Probably, yeah, sure.
All sorts of things. So all of this must be organized. And then when the Kuftis or we find new things, of course, we must decide how do we document it. Does it need any conservation? So we have usually stone conservators or other conservators in our team. Sometimes we find fragile objects, textiles or something, so we call a conservator to remove it or something. So Henrik would photograph it in situ, and then the conservator removes it carefully in order to protect it. Otherwise it might be destroyed.
It's always a battle, for instance, with the conservators, because as an archaeologist, you have your square, you would like to move on to progress, you know, and sometimes it's like a discussion with the conservator. No, we need to consolidate in this and that way, you know, and there you're standing with like 10 guys, you're blocked because you can't do anything, and you're not just moving to another area, for instance, you know. So it's like a constant balance battle, I would say, with the conservators in order to progress, because Marcus is my boss, and if you use the whip, if I'm not going fast down enough, you know, so I have to deliver, so to speak, you know, So it's a constant hackle all the time, I would say.
With the conservators, yes. Yeah. But as you also mentioned, the joy, of course, we are fortunate enough to have our hobby as professional.
Not just this, feeling, really feeling, because you are posing very bureaucratic kind of,
but there is a lot of bureaucracy going on.
Must be really sometimes,
also,
you know, angry, sometimes, you know, joyful, because it's not just a work on progress, it's more than that.
It's more than that, yes, but I'm not a very angry person, for sure. I'm a very stable person. In my mind, it's very stable. So
I can be a bit more angry than Marcus once in a while, also because normally, as Marcus is saying, we are hiring the Kuftis from the East Season, and we try also to hire the same guys or the workers from the local village, because we would like the skills one and not like to train the new ones all over again. But there will always be a moron or two, I would say, so which are completely don't care what they're doing, or super slow or whatever, you know, who are
lazy.
messing,
lazy sometimes,
messing their stuff up, and that's super annoying once in a while. Of course, that would create emotions or anger. But still, you're in a foreign country, another culture, another religion, So you need to keep it in a balance also all the time. You know.
Sometimes they destroy things.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Which is really annoying. Or
Yeah.
when we take our archaeological photos, we don't want any shoe prints
Yeah.
in the area around, so sometimes they just walk across, and which is super annoying. If a surface is very cleaned with brushes, we clean with brush, and sometimes you clean many square meters, and it's very beautiful. And
Spend
somebody
hours and
walks
hours
across,
preparing for that, you know.
it's
Yeah.
really annoying.
Yeah,
of course.
super.
Yes.
Now, also during the process when we explain it, we will take a photograph called in situ, as where the object is in place, you know. But sometimes after you, as Marcus is saying, we will expose a very big area and you clean it up. You can spend a day or two doing that, you know, in order to take what we call the final publication photo, which will go into the final publication, and not as a work photo, you know. And then, as Marcus is saying, suddenly two guys are just passing by, walking over. You're spending 2 days cleaning everything up. You can be a bit angry, you know, and it creates tension and emotions once in a while, I would say. Yeah, definitely does.
Yes. But as we say, we're really fortunate enough to have our hobby as profession. So we like the work, we love the work a lot, and we work very much. So we work 6 days a week on site over there. And
yeah, and then you have Friday, which is normally the day off, but you always have things you have to catch up on. So Friday normally also a bit of work as well, once in a while, I would say, or quite often. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's long days, very long days.
And the working days start at 7 o'clock on site. We have one breakfast break from 10:30 to 11, and we work on site until 2 o'clock. And then we have lunch, and in the afternoon we work again from 4 to 6 at least, usually longer, even in the evening after dinner, because there are still photos to be labeled.
Oh, yeah.
And I want every photo of the day to be finished and labeled until the end, not to take photos from today to tomorrow. So everything of the day must be done.
What I've been doing during the day, taking all the photos, I make the rough adjustments or whatever, and then Marcus and I will sit down maybe half an hour, 1 hour in the evening, and Marcus will decide, or we will decide together, which are the most probable, the best ones. Marcus will have everything, and we will actually repeat the process the day after again. Because if I'm working like a month or two for Marcus, I accumulate thousands of photos. So it doesn't really help that we're doing it in the end, otherwise it'd be too much work. So it needs to be like an ongoing process all the time.
Someone has more? I'll have. Okay.
Sure.
Let me just present a little myself, very brief. My last major work was exhibited in this room, 2019. That year I started a master's in fine art, in history of art, heritage and visual culture that I finished in November. Studying a building with 70 meters wide, not finished here. And I'm starting now to know about archaeology because I was accepted for a master's in archaeology that will start in September. So now I'm getting the feeling where I'm going. Because you really don't know until you are there. So, what made you, from youth, young man, and think to go to be involved in archaeology, to dedicate your life to archaeology, and think? What was the
Motivation?
I was going to say motivation.
Inspiration,
More than motivation, the inner engine that makes you.
Also for me it was easy because in Germany, when you go to gymnasium, grammar school, in the 7th form, history classes start. So I liked history a lot, and from the beginning of the first year of history, then you do the ancient cultures as well, after Stone Age. And so I liked ancient Egypt most, and throughout my school time I read a lot about history, always with the main focus of ancient Egypt, because I liked the culture of ancient Egypt most, because it's steady over 3,000 years, pharaonic times. In Mesopotamia and other areas, cultures and peoples come and go. the empires crash after a while. Egypt is solid as a rock for 3,000 years, which is fantastic. And so I read a lot about many, many ancient cultures. So it was clear from the beginning that I would go into history, and it was only a matter of which culture I would focus on. So I read many cultures, but always going back to Egypt again. And each time I thought, the other cultures are great, I liked it a lot. And when I read a book about ancient Egypt, each time I thought, this is even better than the one I read about the other cultures. So it was always clear that I would become an Egyptologist.
Yeah, me, I started out as a photographer, but I always had a keen interest in history. So I found it very interesting. And then when I got this travel grant back in 2001 for Damascus, I was spending 3 months in the Middle East. I was considering going to study art history at the University of Copenhagen, but then I met a bunch of Near Eastern archaeologists in the institute, and they said, "Oh, Henrik, man, no, you're not going to. Art history is boring, You've got to study archaeology, Yeah, that's super interesting, and as your background as a photographer, it's you will get a job eventually, Yeah, maybe interesting, and always been good finding stuff, I have a keen eye for picking stuff up, So I thought, it would be a good combination, and that's why I enrolled into archaeology or Near Eastern archaeology. Not as specific as Marcus as Egypt, because let's say I'm more the practical guy. I can virtually almost excavate any period, so I don't have a specific keen interest in Egypt, for instance. But all over the Middle East and North Africa, I've been working for the last almost 20 years. But you have to be dedicated, that's for sure, because you're not earning a golden fortune into archaeology, definitely, and it's a lot of hard work.
It gives a lot of pleasure.
It does, sure it does, yeah. It gives a lot of academic and scientific pleasure also, but the friendships, the places you are going to see, the local people you interact with, I think you make friends for life also, and it's important that you.
That's the human side. That
exactly. Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I think it's important also today to build bridges between the different people and different religions, and also because many people around the world have a very narrow-sighted perspective of, for instance, what Islam is or whatever, And so I think in that perspective we are doing an important job as well.
That's true. Yeah, klar. Actually, now we are living in a village, and there are no tourists usually. Now it's changing because our temple is open now to the public since 2020. So from time to time we have now visitors, mainly local school classes, but this winter, now for the first time we had a big tourist group of 28 people. That was the first time. But now after Corona, of course, it's difficult. There are not many tourists in Egypt still, so it's difficult. But as you said, our job has the advantage that we are traveling a lot, and that's of course fabulous because we can excavate everywhere in the world, and that's super. So I also don't want to excavate only in Egypt.
What do you mean about you can excavate? This is a complex thing. You have to have money, you have to hire people, someone has to pay you.
That's true.
So it's...
I was only talking about the skills because I had pre- and early history as subsidiary subjects, so I learned excavation from the beginning. You do not learn it when you study Egyptology. It's not something you learn. So you learn that only if you have another subject such as prehistory. This is where people learn how to excavate. But the funding of archaeological projects is very difficult, sure.
I forgot to say that I have a degree in architecture, and I studied photography in the USA, in Rochester, and I'm looking forward to go to Egypt to see.
You should do that, definitely, Sure. Thank you very much, Marcus, for giving this introduction. It was a pleasure. Thank you for coming here. I'm looking forward to see you again in hopefully Egypt or next winter. We will have a good time. Sure. But not that much camel this season, I hope.
Camel meat, always.
Always, camel, It's too much camel, we'll talk about that later, Thank you very much for everybody for coming today. It was a pleasure. I hope you enjoyed the little chat we had here. and hope you are gaining something from the exhibition here. Maybe we'll know we will do another project next year here, or yeah, we'll see. But thank you very much.
Thank you.